The air in courtroom 3B hung heavy, a sterile stillness punctuated only by the rhythmic scratch of Judge Richard Coleman's pen against his legal pad. Below him, Marla Evans stood in the dock, a black woman whose trembling hands betrayed her dread. Accused of petit larceny, $87 in pilfered groceries, she was to Coleman merely another tally in a ledger of predictable guilt. The gavel rested in his grip, a scepter of finality, ready to dispatch her to county lockup. But then, a faint creak pierced the silence. The courtroom's oak doors parted, and a tiny figure slipped through, a child, no more than 8, her braids swaying, her fists clutching a crumpled paper like a talisman. In that moment, no one, not the bailiff, not the prosecutor, not even Coleman himself, could fathom how this fragile intruder would fracture the edifice of his world. Richard Coleman, at 58, was a judicial institution in his own right, presiding over courtroom 3B for 22 years with the precision of a metronome. His silver-streaked hair, meticulously combed, and icy blue eyes projected an unyielding authority. Born in a rural, all-white enclave where racial delineations were gospel, Coleman had internalized the doctrine of suspicion toward black defendants. It wasn't bias, he insisted to himself. It was pragmatism, a jurisprudential calculus distilled from decades of dockets. Recidivism rates, he'd argue, didn't lie. That morning's case, State versus Marla Evans, was unremarkable on its face. Marla, 34, a single mother scraping by on a laundry worker's wage, faced a misdemeanor charge for stealing essentials: canned beans, a loaf of bread, powdered milk from a corner store. The prosecution's evidence was ironclad. Surveillance footage showed her stuffing items into her frayed coat, her eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Assistant District Attorney Paul Hargrove, a polished 30-something in a tailored suit, delivered his closing with clinical detachment. "This is textbook larceny, Your Honor. Mens rea is established. The actus reus is indisputable." Marla's public defender, Arthur Klein, a man sagging under an avalanche of cases, muttered a half-hearted defense. "Exigent circumstances, Your Honor. An indigent mother in extremis." Coleman barely glanced up. 6 months incarceration, no parole. His mind was set, the sentencing order half-drafted. But as he poised his pen, a flicker of motion disrupted his focus. From the gallery's rear, a small girl emerged. Lila Evans, Marla's 8-year-old daughter. Her faded blue dress hung loose on her slight frame, her sneakers patched with duct tape. She clutched a folded sheet of paper, her dark eyes fixed on her mother. Bailiff Hank Dawson intercepted her, his bulk a wall. "Sit down, kid," he growled. Undeterred, Lila dodged him with a squirrel's agility and shouted, "I got something for the judge. Please, it's important." Coleman's patience snapped. "This is a court of law. Young lady, not a playground. Return to your seat, or I'll hold you in contempt." His tone was steel, but Lila's gaze, pleading, unbowed, pierced him. "It's about my mama," she said, her voice quivering yet resolute. With a grudging sigh, Coleman waved Dawson off. "Approach the bench. Make it quick." Lila's sneakers squeaked across the hardwood as she tendered her offering, a handwritten letter on torn notebook paper, paired with a crayon drawing. Coleman accepted it with a dismissive grunt, expecting a rehearsed plea, some juvenile pro-se motion to sway him. But the scrawled words halted him cold. "Dear Mr. Judge, I'm Lila Evans, 8 years old. My mama ain't a bad person. She works at the laundry every day, but it don't pay enough. My brother Sammy, he's 4, and he coughs all the time. The doctor says he needs medicine, $1.60 a bottle, and last week we only had $12 left. Mama cried when she took the food. I told her I'd eat less so Sammy could have more, but she said no. I don't want her to go away. She's all we got. Please let her come home. I drew us, so you'd see we're a family." The sketch showed 3 stick figures, mother, daughter, son, holding hands beneath a lopsided yellow sun. Sammy wore a scarf, a child's attempt to depict his illness. Coleman's breath hitched, a visceral pang he couldn't suppress. He glanced at Lila, her hands twisting her dress hem, then at Marla, who wept silently, her head bowed. Hargrove cleared his throat, irritation sharpening his voice. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant hearsay. Emotional exhibits don't amend the penal code or negate culpability." Coleman's hand slashed the air. "Stand down," he barked, his timbre low and dangerous. He reread the letter, each line a chisel against his convictions. "I'd eat less." An 8-year-old bargaining her hunger for her brother's survival. And he, cloaked in judicial robes, had been seconds from severing their lifeline without a shred of due diligence. Memories surged. Emily, his daughter, now 28 and estranged at 8 years old, pressing crayon masterpieces into his hands. Houses, trees, smiling families he'd squirreled away in a drawer, too proud to admit their worth. Lila had no such luxury. Her mother stood before him, her fate in his docket-stained hands. "Ms. Evans," he said, his voice softening despite himself, "why didn't you detail your son's condition in your allocution?" Marla lifted her tear-streaked face, stunned. I tried, Your Honor. I didn't think you'd care." The words landed like a gavel. Coleman recoiled inwardly, decades of rulings flashing before him. Countless black faces, dismissed pleas, lives reduced to case numbers. His taxonomy of guilt, so meticulously constructed, began to crumble. Lila stepped closer, her voice a trembling thread. "Did you see Sammy in the picture? He used to chase me around, but now he just lays there, cuffing. If Mama's gone, who's going to sing to him when he's scared?" Coleman's vision blurred. He adjusted his glasses, a futile shield against the dampness in his eyes. Sammy, a child he'd never met, took shape, small, fragile, gasping in a dim room. He remembered Emily's pneumonia at 5, the terror of her shallow breaths, the relief when antibiotics, bought without a second thought, restored her. What if he'd been Marla, scraping by on $12, choosing between food and medicine? He slammed his palm on the bench, the sound of thunderclap. "Ms. Evans," he declared, voice thick with uncharacteristic tremor, "I'm amending the charge to a Class B misdemeanor. 30 days community service, no custodial sentence. Additionally, I'll ensure your son receives his medication." Judgment rendered. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Marla crumpled against the dock, sobs racking her frame. Lila squealed, "Thank you, Mr. Judge," and flung herself into her mother's arms. Hargrove's jaw dropped, his protest swallowed by the moment. Coleman rose, retreating to chambers as the gavel fell, its echo a dirge for his old certainties. In his chambers, Coleman collapsed into his leather chair, the turkey sandwich and black coffee abandoned. He yanked open the drawer, spilling Emily's faded drawings across the desk, stick figure families, a younger him with a crooked grin. Beside them, Lila's letter glared, a mirror to his failures. Had he judged Emily's mother so cavalierly, would he forgive himself? Sleep eluded him that night. Compelled by a gnawing unrest, he drove to Marla's address, a dilapidated tenement row, its sagging roofs leaking despair. Parking across the street, he peered through a fogged window. Marla rocked Sammy, his coughs a staccato rasp, while Lila hummed a lullaby, her voice a fragile bulwark against the dark. The scene seared him. He dialed a pro bono clinic, securing Sammy's medication anonymously, then sped away, the image of their frailty branded into his mind. But the reprieve was short-lived. Hargrove, incensed by the ruling, filed a judicial misconduct complaint with the State Commission on Judicial Conduct, alleging Coleman's emotional lapse compromised impartiality. Local headlines screamed, "Judge Buckles in theft case, justice or sentimentality." Summoned to a disciplinary hearing, Coleman faced a panel of peers. "You've subverted precedent," one sneered. "This ruling undermines the integrity of the bench." Coleman stood, his voice a controlled inferno. "Precedent isn't sacrosanct when it blinds us to equity. If you equate a child's plea for her brother's life with manipulation, then your integrity's the one in question." Silence reigned. The complaint was quashed, but whispers lingered. Weeks later, a new crisis erupted. Sammy's condition worsened, bronchitis spiraling into pneumonia, despite the medication Coleman had arranged. Marla, bound by her service hours, couldn't afford a hospital visit. Lila, desperate, appeared at the courthouse unannounced, slipping past security to Coleman's chambers. She burst in, breathless, her eyes wild. "Mr. Judge, Sammy's real bad. He can't breathe right, and Mama's stuck cleaning streets." Coleman froze, the docket in his hand forgotten. "Where is he now?" he demanded. "Home, with Mrs. Carter next door, but she don't know what to do." Without a word, Coleman grabbed his coat, barking at his clerk, "Cancel my afternoon session." He drove Lila to the tenement, sirens of guilt blaring in his head. Inside, Sammy lay on a threadbare couch, his lips tinged blue, his wheezes labored. Mrs. Carter, an elderly neighbor, wrung her hands. "I called 911, but they're slow out here." Coleman, no medic but spurred by instinct, propped Sammy up, recalling Emily's bout years ago. "Breathe slow, son," he murmured, his voice a lifeline. When paramedics arrived, they stabilized the boy, crediting Coleman's positioning with buying critical minutes. At the hospital, Sammy survived barely. Marla arrived post-shift, collapsing at Coleman's feet in gratitude. "You saved him," she sobbed. He shook his head. "Lila did. She wouldn't let me look away." The ordeal reshaped Coleman. He overhauled his approach, scrutinizing mitigating factors, probing beyond indictments. He didn't don a cape, but the gavel grew lighter in his hand. He funded Sammy's ongoing care through discreet channels, his name absent from the checks. Months later, Lila returned, her sneakers new, bearing a drawing. Coleman beside her family, gavel raised, a sun overhead. "You're in our picture now," she said, grinning, then darted off. He pinned it beside Emily's relics, a gallery of redemption. For the first time in decades, he smiled, a small cracked thing, but real.